Good morning and welcome to the fourth lecture of this series on the theory of travel writing. In our earlier lectures, we've talked about the presence of travel writing, its the representation of the self, its literary qualities, and other features of travel writing. At this point of time, we've also talked about colonialism and travel writing, and we've talked about how the entire imperial gaze has been used in the function of travel writing, as it were, and how the empire has written back in terms of post-colonial travel writing. What we will discuss today is the intersection between travel and gender, and travel writing and gender. We'll discuss a host of questions here. We'll take a look at how, travel has been a gendered phenomenon in most of Western culture, how the advent of modernity changed the equation to a degree. We'll take a look at how, women traveled during the colonial period and recorded their experiences. We'll be asking how and what positions, subject positions, they took in this process of writing, what the reception of women's travel writing was like, and how various theoretical formulations have tried to take a look at women's travel writings, especially at the intersections between gender, race, and writing, as it were. So it promises to be a diverse kind of a lecture, which will look at several such aspects of travel writing throughout. Now, I'd like to begin, of course, by going back to the Greek myth of Penelope and the way in which, both Ulysses and Telemachus go about their own respective ways, and Ulysses travels, as it were, to far off distant lands. Penelope, on the other hand, is rooted in one's place. She has a lot of suitors, no doubt, but ultimately she's rooted to this category called the home and the safe haven. So this is an allocation of roles, that seems to be deep seated within culture, both Western and Eastern, and therefore the very act of travel, has been gendered from times immemorial. Now, restlessness, freedom of movement, and taste of adventure, all these have been traditionally ascribed to the male, and therefore the woman's proper and preferred location has been domesticity and the home. Now, this is the dominant motive, as you will see, in even the medieval pilgrimage. And if you take a look at Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, you will see how few women actually traveled even during the course of the pilgrimage. Of course, you do have the prioress, and you do have the wife of Bath, who's this extremely garrulous, dominating woman. But the wife of Bath, seen in terms of her sexual promiscuity, seen in terms of her, as it were, comic appeal, is an exception rather than the rule. Now, the situation changes to a certain degree when tourism begins from the late 18th century onwards. So opportunities for women to travel solely for pleasure steadily increased. Now, even then, independent travel was only possible within standard, supposedly safe tourist circuit, and therefore severely geographically circumscribed. Now, by the late 1800s, of course, European and American women were able to tour Egypt and the Middle East, so an established tourist circuit. And we have examples of conventional tourism itineraries in the travel writings of Hester Stanhope, Mary Kingsley, Mary French, May French Sheldon in Africa, Marianne North, and Isabella Bird, who traveled far across the world. But the one text which I would like to go back to is a text which was published in the late 1770s, but was a unique text in many ways, was Lady Mary Worthley Montagu's visit to Istanbul in the early 18th century. And remember, this is published much later. And Mary Worthley Montego, incidentally, was one of the very few women who was actually given access to a Turkish harem. So she brought back from Turkey a glimpse into what was never accessible to the European male traveler, as it were. So Worthley Montagu's text, as it were, stands as a very important landmark and set a few theoretical considerations about women writing travel in her works. Now, you'll also remember that, of course, that both literacy and class awareness amongst women was increasing rapidly during the 18th century. So there was not only a market for travel writing by men, which sort of brought the exotic, which brought the unfamiliar to culture, but also, very interestingly, now women liked to read what women actually, when women actually traveled. Therefore, in 1701, we have Celia Fiennes, and these are relatively minorly known travel writings right now, but in their own ages, they sold well. There was also the Diary of Sarah Kemble Knight, which was published in 1704. It was a travel record from Boston to New York. So, interestingly, by this time, women have started to experiment with travel writing. But we must remember that when compared with the volume of male travel writing, there was no explosion of women's travel, as it were, because women did not travel that much. Therefore, the records show that in this particular century, say from 1710 to 1820s, we actually have only 40 odd women's travelogues in their full form really published. Now, if we take a look at these travelogues as a body, then certain phenomena becomes very interestingly observable when we analyze them. The first and foremost is women were very often not traveling independently. Not everyone was like Mary Wortley Montego. They were traveling with a male companion, right? So they were adjunct travelers, really. And this awareness of penetrating a genre that was dominantly male is, deeply engraved within these writings. Now, I will, of course, reiterate again and again, the travel writing by 1700 has become an important rite of masculine self-fashioning. It was customary for the aristocratic young man to go for a grand tour to fashion his selfhood. Now, this journey, its arduousness, its physical demands, its interactions, was a demonstration of manhood, a rite of passage from boyhood to adult masculinity, a test of one's rationality and the capacity to innovate. And therefore, it was, as Notre Fry has pointed out, in many ways related to the medieval romance of the quest, where, proper and total selfhood became the kind of goal towards which a man was striving for. So you will have to remember that when a woman was traveling, she was traveling against this grain of established travel conventions. Why was she traveling? That's the There was no real quest for female selfhood, as it were. So she was very often traveling as as a kind of a companion. Now, therefore, two strategies emerge, and this is very interesting. The first strategy is that the woman is very apologetic about writing an account of travel. So there is a sense of discourse of modesty, as it were, which creeps into these travel writings. And they very often suggest that these travel writings are not for public reading, but for private circulation. So this is what has been called as the modesty topos. The modesty topos, which involved, the woman sort of suggesting that her travel writing was primarily meant for private consumption. There was a great deal of irony and self-deprecation. So the woman was continuously, sort of deprecating herself, directing irony against her. And therefore, these cultural constraints was, as it were, creating this kind of a reluctant woman traveler who nevertheless recorded her experiences, very often in the form of a memoir. So, the difference between male travel writing and women's travel writing in this age was that empirical observations were largely, ignored, rather than subjective personal accounts and relationships were explored. So, in a certain way, at the beginning of writing travel, women and men actually wrote differently. Men were bold, observant, rational, scientific. Women were apologetic. They were almost conscious about encroaching into into men's territories. It was ironic, self-deprecating, and very often, it was marked by passages of subjectivity which altered with passages of objective records. The second factor was that, these women were almost always conscious about the fact that they would be seen as anachronisms in the print market. So this idea of the lady traveler became very dominant in Western travel writing. And very interestingly, if you take a look at it, they were always conscious that however much they wrote, they would always be taken in terms of, a kind of an anachronism, and the kind of somebody who would not really matter very seriously, rather than a travel writer which was travel writing which were written by men. Now, therefore, you see, to penetrate this, market of travel writing, as it were, women often had to sort of foreground their femininity and, be apologetic in this sense of the term, that always to point out that this was for private consumption, and that they might be, erratic in their records. So it's interesting in the way, the first wave of women writing actually takes place. Now, the second thing that I would like to point out here is that, within, say, the travel writing of Montego, for example, there was a consciousness that women could enter into spaces that the men could not. So how did the subject of women's travel writing differ from men's travel writing, right? So it is suggested that and this is the early theoretical stance, that men described external landscapes, whereas women were more concerned with the landscape or the inner landscape, the writer's own inner writings. Jane Robinson, for example, wrote that men's travel accounts are to do with what and where, women's with how and why. Now, once again, these are very broad generalizations, but what the women initially looked at were very often spaces of the home in the culture that they looked at, the domestic conditions of the contemporary territories that they looked at, and the private spheres rather than the public locations that the men often talked about. So in terms of content also, and you can obviously relate this with the kind of writings that Montego would write about, but interestingly, while these were early formulations, we might also question them. For example, the other thing, I'm sorry, I should mention this, that certain subjects were, as it were, excluded from women's travel writing altogether. What were these subjects? For example, matters of philosophy, politics, commerce, science, and public affairs. I repeat, philosophy, politics, commerce, and science were completely, as it were, ignored. So women were seen largely as amateurs. Now, yesterday I talked about the travel writer as using the garb of the amateur, but the woman was definitely positioned as an amateur who did not have access to these specialized disciplines, and therefore their ways of travel writing were different. Ironically, this could be immediately challenged by the writing of Montego. Now, Mary Worthley Montego actually looked at the system of inoculation in Turkey. And she looked at the inoculation system against smallpox, wrote extensively about it, leading to initial inoculations in Britain. So already, even as I talk about gendered categories, here was a travel writer who was penetrating the discourse of science, observing contemporary practices in inoculation and bringing it back to England. However, it is true that Mary Wortley Montego's bulk of the travel writing was engaged with the Turkish harem, the condition of women in that particular country, the condition of children, child rearing, parenting, and so on. Therefore, in a certain sense, Wortley Montego was moving away from the masculine discourses, but she did penetrate the masculine discourse of science altogether. Now, there's another thing that Mary Wortley Montego suggested, and women's travel writings always did, is that there was this dichotomy within women's travel writings about their own subjected status. Now, Indira Ghosh makes this very interesting point when she says that when women traveled, they were always placed in this liminality, the space of liminality. They were conquerors by race and conquered in terms of gender. That's a very interesting turn of phrase that she uses. Conquerors by race and conquered by gender, subjected by gender. So Mary Wortley Montego, very interestingly, looks at the Turkish veil, I would say the parda, right? And writes that Turkish women have far greater license because of the masquerade rather than the European woman who is completely under the subjection of man. So there exists a kind of awareness of sisterhood amongst which cuts across, race and the condition of women's being under the rule of patriarchy. At the same time, she uses the Turkish veil as a kind of a way through which women could, move around in society without letting men know where they were going, and suggests a way of sort of resisting patriarchy. So we notice within these travel writings an acute sensibility of gender and also a sort of resistance to the conditions of patriarchy. So, on the one hand, what I'm trying to arrive at is that women's travel writing is creating particular spaces and strategies for itself. They're writing within the conventions of contemporary travel writing by men, but carving out niches, looking at these spaces, resisting the discourses, and very often also, in a certain way, fashioning their own writings. Now, let me come to another point here, since I'm mentioning this. Very often, rather than describe, cities, military formations, or scientific data, women's travel writings would often describe landscapes. So the picturesque, the landscape would be very strongly present in travel writing by women. And the idea of a different aesthetics for women's travel writings was largely developing around this description of landscape and the sentiments that they produced within women. So the yardstick, as it were, for writing travel, the conventions of writing travel, and the yardstick for writing travel by women were largely different. So they had to be conscious about, one, the idea that they were women who were traveling, and you will of course remember that travel conditions were not so conducive. So traveling for a woman would not be very easy in these particular territories. They were dispersing, Europeans were dispersing across the globe. So to be a woman traveler was a matter of hardship. Nevertheless, they traveled and they wrote. They wrote with the idea that a woman in Egypt would be standing out, and they would always be considered as women. So there was a certain degree of resistance against this. There's also a certain way of looking at landscape, looking at the emotions that the landscape and the territories generated. There was a certain space that they could enter into domesticity, looking at different nuances of cultures, right? I'll give you an example from Indian travel writing also. Now, apart from the texts that you will read, this is a text by Durgavati Ghosh, for example, who was the daughter of one of India's premier psychiatrists, Girinder Shekhar Bush, and she travels to England approximately in the early 20th century, very much as a kind of a modern Indian woman. But even then, she's always looking at the way in which European mothers, for example, are spitting on their handkerchiefs and rubbing the faces of the children. There's this very strange encounter with Freud, for example, where she's looking at the great psychiatrist as a kind of divinity, but then Freud is asking her, why are you so afraid of dogs? And she's writes that she wanted to know, what was the reason that Freud was sort of kept two dogs at his side. So was there any particular psychology? So this kind of in-betweenness, public awareness of public issues, as well as a focus on domesticity, was marked within these travel writings, as it were. So this was what the 18th century, early 19th century, entire imperial period did. Now, the question that therefore emerges is that, is the female gaze substantially different from the male? Yes, the answer is yes, it is to a substantial degree different in the spaces that it looks at, in the landscapes that it looks at, and in the way in which it looks at itself. You see, the male traveler is almost always non-self-conscious, right? He's aware, he's confident that he's the monarch of all that he surveys. So he does not so much look at himself and his internal mechanisms or his internal as it were, positions, his ability to write, his authority to write. He claims authority almost by default. But the woman, when she's traveling, is always hesitant, and therefore always continuously looking at herself also. So in a certain sense, you see, women's travel writing is much more self-conscious in that sense of the term than the male travelers, than her male compatriot. Right. So, and as I pointed out, women would obviously very often say that this was not meant for publication. Let me give you an example. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Sunny Memoirs of Foreign Lands, 1845, writes that the following letters were written by Mrs. Stowe for her own personal friends, particularly the members of her own family. So pretty disingenuous in the sense that she would publish it for the public, but claim that it was really for private consumption. Now, the other thing that I would like to sort of talk about is this issue of identity and identification. Now, the other I'm sorry, before I come to that, let me also go back to the style of women's travel writing once again. Now, here is a text by Fanny Parks, who writes, whose title is A Pilgrim in Search of the Picturesque. Right. So the picturesque, the sentimental travelogue, was greatly patronized by women. So in many cases, prioritizing feeling over intellect, subjectivism over objectivism. And Fanny Parks, for example, is jumping from one topic to another. So there's a kind of a digressive, fragmentary tendency. And therefore, it is also marked by certain moral and emotional directives, which we do not observe to that extent in male travel writing. Now, we have also suggested that women travelers concern themselves much more with domestic details like food preparation, childcare, laundering of clothes. All these are very often integrated within the travel writing in a way that men would not probably do that. And the harem and the zenana become very often, places which the woman writer would visit. Now, let me now return to this question about identity and identification. Did gendered identity and the concept of being subjugated by patriarchy mean that women writers during the period of colonization actually possessed a different attitude of sympathy to the colonized? So my question is, when women travelers were traveling during colonization from England to, say, India, would they identify with the Indians because they themselves were subjugated by patriarchy? This was a thesis which was, forwarded by the first wave of feminists, really, suggesting that women travelers were far more considerate, were far more aware of oppression, and therefore far more sympathetic towards the colonial condition. Now, unfortunately, of course, analysis of travel texts show that these were largely, exaggerated. So even if Mary Wortley Montego does have a sympathy and takes up Turkish women as almost sisters, the bulk of the women traveler writers writing during colonization were falling back upon the same stereotypes of race that the male travelers were engaging in. So in terms of identity and identification, we do not really see any kind of major distinction between the perspectives and prejudices of male travel writers and women travel writers. So the discourse of colonialism would be repeated by most of them. Now, for example, Sarah Mills, when she writes Discourses of Difference, really does not locate any great degree of difference in the representation of the power structures, only that the women writers would interact with more members of other nations, especially women, right? So the thesis that women writers really travel differently in discourses of power has largely been proved to be feminist wish-fulfilling thinking. Take an example of, say, Janet Shaw, for example, when she sort of moves to the Caribbean in the 1770s. She describes the slaves as brutes, children as monkeys, and goes on to justify whippings as merry corporeal punishment which inflicts no pain on the slave's mind. So, no fundamental difference in terms of power. Now, as the century sort of deepens, more and more women sort of start to travel. And interestingly, this travel is not unidirectional, in the sense that more and more women from the colonies also travel to London and the metropole. Now, this then means another mode of women traveling, or another category of women traveling. Now, the theorist whom I'm going to go back to here is actually Inderpal Grewal. Now, Inderpal Grewal writes in her Home and Harem that European education and subjectivity greatly altered the Indian mental landscape, as it were, the mental intellectual landscape of India. And therefore, there was a great deal of penetration of the rational within the Indian mind, as it were. But within the harem and the zanana and the parda, of course, this degree of subjectivity or rationality was largely denied. So the home and the harem, as it were, the home as in the country, and the harem was actually, well delineated and separated in terms of the access to rationality and the access to modernity. Therefore, when women were traveling from India to the West, they came for the first time, as it were, in contact with modernity at large. Take, for example, Panditya Ramabai, or say, for example, somebody like Durgavati Ghosh. When they travel, it is for the first time that they encounter the freedom that women have access to. And they are greatly, in a certain sense, enamored. They are greatly they react very strongly to these freedoms that are accepted and realize the conditions of the harem that the woman is still located in India. And in certain ways, this act of travel writing by the woman therefore becomes a conscious act of resistance through which not only do they challenge the imperial strategies of representation, but they also challenge the representations of the male counterparts writing from India. So I'm trying to take a look at how they become, as it were, texts which are located at the interactions of race and gender, challenging stereotypes of race as well as stereotypes of gender. But please remember that these women travelers were largely upper middle class Indian women. We have to take into cognizance that a large number of women also traveled as ayahs, right? They were taken back by the British colonizers, taken back to England, where they acted as ayahs for their children. We have very little voices from these women and how they felt, just as we have very little voices from the male lashkars who worked in the ships and were largely uneducated. So the voice that we have of travel writing is largely, you'll have to acknowledge, is from a certain class of women who had access to education, who had access to a reasonable degree of modernity. But within the writings of these women, we find that the challenge of travel writing is not only at observing details that women would not observe, but also in recognizing how nationalist discourses were challenging the hegemony of the West, while at the same time recognizing how Western society could offer a kind of antidote to the oppression of women within the Indian condition. So we have multiple layers of representational strategies that these women writers were engaged in. While we take women's travel writing as a kind of a broad category, we'll have to understand that the distinctions of race, the distinctions of class, and the distinctions of positionality make this entire category of women's writing extremely diverse, as it were, right? So, to lump them together into one category of gendered travel writing would probably not be very adequate. Now, before I move on to the next part, what happens to travel writing after, say, the colonial period, I would like to also add one more thing. Even within the 18th and the 19th centuries, there was a gendering of travel, in the sense that the explorer scientific narrative, which thrust into objectivity, which thrust with its thrust on scientific data, on its third person perspectives, omniscience, power, military might, was entirely masculine in its configuration. But there were male travelers also, and Lawrence Stern immediately comes to mind, who were writing travel writings which were gendered in the sense that they lay stress on sentiment, they lay stress on subjectivity. They very often engaged in copious acts of sympathy and tearfulness. Therefore, even within men's travel writings, the different strategies and this, opposition between objectivity and subjectivity created gendered categories. Interestingly, these gendered categories were ones which the women then used in their subjective travel writing as well, using fragmentation, using the topos of modesty as a kind of a strategy within which they could carve out their place in travel writing. Now, I also like to take a look at the popularity of these forms. Why did women read travel writing? Or what was the popularity? What was the reason for the popularity of women's travel writing during this period? The first was that, of course, and this is something that many travel writers noted, that they were a kind of exception. And therefore, even men wanted to know what a woman was doing in Egypt and how she would feel when she went to the necropolis, on the one hand. On the other, for many women who were part and parcel of this entire patriarchal setup and who would never be able to travel, reading travel writing itself produced a kind of a resistance, a sort of imaginatively configuring how or what it would mean to be a woman to travel to distant lands, just as the way in which many women travel writers saw the act of travel writing as claiming a space for themselves within the dominant spaces of patriarchy. So this entire category of travel writing by women during the colonial period, both traveling from the west to the east and from the east to the west, was deeply entrenched in certain discourses of power. And these discourses of power were intersections of colonial power as well as the power of patriarchy. So women were placed in between, colonizers by race, colonized by gender. And their writing strategies accordingly they adjusted and innovated their writing strategies according to these multiplicities. However, one must note that the entire gamut of travel writing by women during this period had their own differences as well. So it was not monolithic, as it were, and every position of class or positionality determined how specific travel writings would emerge. Now let me take a look at what happens once we have greater women's liberation. So what happens, say, after the 1930s, 40s, and especially the 1960s, and we have an explosion of women's writings in many cases. So education, professional opportunities become available to women. Travel becomes much more comfortable and faster. So this entire arduousness of travel disappears. And therefore we have, women traveling to all corners of the globe as professionals, scientists, anthropologists, news reporters, political commentators, economic analysts. Take the case of Joan Didion's Salvador, for example, published 1983, which is a commentary on the state of the politics of the nation. Take, for example, Christiana Dodwell's Travels with the Fortunate, an African adventure, which provide, adventure, ethnographic discovery, which is extremely professionally done. Irma Kurtz, for example, goes back to the picaresque narrative, and very often, many of these travel narratives also sort of are franker with the sexual encounters that these women have. For example, D. Burkett's Serpent in Paradise, 1997, or Fiona Pitt Kethley's Journeys to the Underworld, which freely talk about, travel writers' encounters with men, the sexual experiments. We also have, for the first time in 2019, Gillian Kendall's Something to Declare, good lesbian travel writing. So we have an entire discourse of sexuality now permeating travel writing in a way that it never really did prior to this era. However, even within these constraints, and that is where, your particular travel text will come in, women do have certain constraints in which they travel. The fear of violence is one, especially of sexual violence. The fear of rape, whether crossing the Sahara or the street at night, affects women in the way that they move. The presence of the female body and the kind of needs of the female body figure in the way that they must travel. And therefore, what we are noticing today is more and more women writing about their experiences of travel, claiming spaces as men, but also acutely conscious of encroaching into a form of activity that has been masculine and claiming it for themselves, as well as, claiming a genre and therefore guiding other women through their experiences hitherto unacknowledged of either hitting the road or of expressing themselves or expressing their sexualities. So what we have is women's travel writing continuously engaging in different disciplines, as well as creating channels and replications for women themselves to travel. Very often, what we now locate is whenever this new independent woman is challenged as just a woman, she would very often rebel against this. And this is an example, for example, from Robin Davidson, a traveler in Australia, who was known by the term of Camel Lady because she was one of the first women to actually cross this terrain. And she bitterly resented this writing. A myth was being created where I would appear different and exceptional. Had I been a man, I'd be lucky to get a mention in the Willona Times, let alone international press coverage. Neither could I imagine them coining the phrase camel gentleman. Camel lady had that nice patronizing, belittling ring to it. Labeling, pigeonholing, what a splendid trick it is. What I'm trying to suggest is that some of the prejudices about women traveling have still lingered on. And in many of these women's travel writings, a protest against these prejudices, an expression of the prejudicial concerns of patriarchy, the ideas of sisterhood among women, free and franker expressions of sexuality in heteronormative ways are all entering into women's travel writings in a very big way. At the same time, women are also creating, like Madhuvina, specific travel books which are meant to guide women about the difficulties and the strategies of traveling, how to deal with men, how to deal with menstrual cycles, how to deal with physical problems, and all these issues. And there are therefore trying to sort of bring more and more women into the ambit of travel, right? So we will suggest therefore that women's travel writing has had a longish history. It was initially restricted to the pilgrimage, and even then it was very inadequate. With colonialism, tourism, the woman traveled either as a companion or independently. And we've seen how women created travel to different spaces, how women used different strategies of representation to claim a space into what was essentially patriarchal writing. And we've also seen how there were exceptions like Mary Wortley Montego, who not only described spaces that were hitherto unknown to men, also talked about public scientific issues like inoculation, and also, sort of recognized the oppression that Turkish women and English women shared. However, as we've seen, many of these women do not really have any differentiated strategies of power from their male counterparts. They very often reiterate these strategies of power, the common tropes, the common prejudices. So it is very premature to talk about, any great idea about sisterhoods among colonial and non-colonial women. And finally, we've seen how these change within the modern trope, where women sort of break into travel in a big way, where travel writing explodes, and where newer forms of sexuality, scientific discourses, political discourses are all positions that the women take up. Even then, we've also seen how this being a woman and the prejudice of a woman writer writing about travel still lingers on within the genre. If you are very careful and looking at, say an index of travel writing by men and women, you will still find that travel is still largely a male perspective, and travel writing has overwhelmingly still been a male perspective. So even though the gender imbalance is slowly being corrected, it still lingers, both in terms of actual travel undertaken and travel writing made, and also in terms of the strategies through which travel writing operates. It is with that then that I'll come to the end of this particular lecture and take your comments here. I have a question from Boyjonto. Boyjonto asks, how did the women traveling from colonized lands react or perceive the oppressed and minority classes in the colonizers' land? That's an interesting question. I really don't have an answer, Boyjonto, in that sense of the term. There are, of course, few such accounts where the dominant theme is either to challenge these Western assumptions about, greater civilizations. Both Ramabai and Durgabati Ghosh, they are slightly surprised that the existence of poverty and the degree of poverty within the English shores, but they really do not make any very great comments on it. So uh, I would not really say that there's sufficient evidence as yet to comment upon your question, although that remains a very interesting one. Modurima asks, can we include the recorded experience of female journalists staying in foreign countries as television and social media as travel writing? It's a very good question. Modurima, thank you for that. Absolutely. Absolutely, we should. What you are doing now is you are challenging the genre of travel writing itself. So you're just suggesting it's travel communication. And writing is only one part of this communication. You're absolutely true. Vlogs, internet videos, all these are now parts and parcels of, travel communication, as it were. So, yes, I would say documentaries, records of video journalists are all to be included in terms of travel writing. So, thank you there. You see, at one point of time, till the visual did not enter, travel writing was largely textual in that sense of the term. Textual in the sense it was writing. But now the entire concept of travel has largely been changed. And so you are right in that sense. So when we discuss travel, we need a different order of representational discussion as well. But unfortunately, I am not equipped in that particular discipline to offer you a greater insight. Shogato asks, is the process of women's travel writing in a certain way a challenge against form and mode of those travel writings basically written by a male writer? Yes, of course. And that is where I was talking about Mary Wortley Montego. I was talking about the picaresque mode, picturesque mode, the kind of fragmentation that they do. And it's very insidious in the way that they comment that it is not meant for public consumptions, at the same time very clearly aware that they are going to be publicly consumed. So yes, women have worked within the tradition. They have taken on the strategies that the male writers have used and moderated them, modulated them, changed them according to their own needs and the market interests as well. So yes, definitely in certain senses they have challenged them. Very often there are direct challenges to the way in which male travel writing has only talked about certain spaces, and they therefore bring up alternative ways of representation. So yes, this element of challenge has always remained as an integral part of female travel writing. Right. I think those are the questions which I could see at this point of time. So thank you very much for listening in patiently. We've covered more or less the theoretical gamut of travel writing as such, but remember that these theoretical perspectives have all been very Western, right? And we've largely discussed Western travel writing. So how does Indian travel writing emerge? What are its salient concerns? How does it change from the colonial to the modern age? And what kind of texts, strategies are we looking at? This is where I will be breaking into new ground tomorrow, and we'll be taking up these concerns about Indian travel writing in our next discussion. Tomorrow at 10:30 then. Thank you for being with me today, and we hope that we'll be meeting once again tomorrow. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.